Welcome to the Sitrep podcast, your source for historical military wargaming. I'm your host, Oriskini Jim, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli War fought in October 1973. We're going to be using the 7 Days to the River Rhine game system by Great Escape Games. Now, those of you who follow our channel on a regular basis are going to know that the Arab-Israeli conflict is one of my favorite subjects of the post-1945 period, especially the Yom Kippur War of 73. This one is definitely my favorite, especially when it comes to wargaming. It was obviously the biggest of these conflicts. It had the most battlefield technology deployed all at once. And this is probably where the various Arab armies involved came closest to any kind of parity with their Israeli foes. Let's be honest, in some ways the Arab armies were superior to their Israeli foes. This is especially true in the southern part of the war, fought in the Sinai Peninsula between Israel and Egypt. Egypt starts the war at 1400 hours local, 6 October 1973, with kind of a masterpiece assault across the Suez Canal into the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula. We see the fall of the Israeli Bar-Lev line. We see the destruction of the initial Israeli counterattacks on 8 October, known as Black Monday. Things are going pretty well for the Egyptians until the Battle of Wadi Marbouk and really a whole bunch of other battles, all taking place on 14 October 1973, and finally the tide has turned. Immediately after this wind change, and I do mean immediate, like later that same night, Israeli generals are already deep into planning a massive counter-assault back across the Suez Canal behind the Egyptian armies facing. This is going to become Operation Abiri Lev, or Stout-Hearted Men, sometimes more popularly known as Operation Gazelle. It begins as an infantry, followed by a bridging and finally an armored offensive across really a very narrow section of the Suez Canal. And once the Israelis are across and they have their bridgehead secure, they begin this great pivot to the south, spearheaded by 2 armored divisions, supported of course by all kinds of integral infantry and artillery units. Their ultimate objective is the city of Port Suez, at the extreme southern tip of the Suez Canal. If the Israelis can reach Port Suez and take it in sufficient strength, they will have sliced off and isolated the entire Egyptian Third Army. This pretty much accounts for half of the forces that the Egyptians have been able to push into the Sinai Peninsula so far. The problem for the Israelis, actually they have several problems, but the immediate problem on their plate is that strong Egyptian forces are being mobilized out of the Egyptian backfield and are now attacking into their right wing. They're hitting their right flank as the Israelis are trying to make that final drive to the south. This is the battle that we're going to see on today's table, where we have elements of the 113th Egyptian Mechanized Brigade. This is part of the 6th Mechanized Division, and the 3rd Armored Brigade of the 4th Armored Division. These units are both part of the Egyptian Third Army that again is trying to fight its way out of this trap. Against them, we have the Israelis with elements of the 890th Paratrooper Battalion. They are jumping out of M3 half-tracks and M113s. This is more of a tailgate jump kind of an operation. And part of the 460th Brigade, Gabi Amir's brigade, of Bren Adan's 162nd Armored Division as it makes that big final push down towards Port Suez. Now, once you get a look at our table, some of the features you find there might surprise you a little. This is not a desert battle. Once you leave the Sinai Desert, you cross the Suez Canal and you come onto the west bank and start that big turn south, we find a lot of agricultural projects, freshwater canals, and a surprising degree of urban development. In fact, the terrain on the Suez West Bank was so thick that Israeli soldiers at the time called crossing over the Suez and entering this area going to Vietnam. Was it really as thick as Vietnam? Of course not, but after you've been fighting in the Sinai Desert for a couple of weeks, pretty much your mom's garden is going to look like Vietnam by that point. As far as setup and objectives go, this is kind of a sideways meeting engagement. We have the Israelis moving south, trying to cut off the Egyptians, and we have the Egyptians coming in from the west, trying to cut the Israelis off in turn. Is it going to shake out like that? Let's go to the footage and find out. Here is our table set up for today's wargame. It is an 8x4 table set up in 15mm. We also have our initial camera orientation set up properly for once, where we are looking out of the south into the north. So as we pan over here to the left-hand side of the table, we properly see the Egyptians coming out of the west as they did historically. Moving over here to the eastern side of the table, we see where the Israelis were coming out of the north along the eastern table edge. The scenario setup does allow them to pivot westward against the incoming Egyptians. Apparently one of their scouts or maybe one of their aircraft alerted them to the incoming threat. Also, as we drift back over here to the Egyptian setup zone, we can see where they have a lot of armor coming in for sure. And there is still more armor coming in various reinforcement phases that we'll get into as the game progresses. It's going to be really tough to hide this kind of firepower approaching this close. So we see these canals on the table, and I just want to quickly clear up, you guys probably already know this, but despite the title of this video, this is not actually the Suez Canal. The actual Suez Canal would be some distance off of the east-hand side of this table. Also, even in these days, the Suez Canal, I mean, it's been widened since, but even back in these days, Suez Canal was an easy 200 meters across in most places. That would make it in 15 millimeter just short of 7 feet. It would be pretty much the entire table. What these are the small freshwater irrigation canals that you would see honeycombing and crisscrossing all over this West Bank region, providing irrigation for all these agricultural projects that made up this terrain. Here we are looking at the Israelis. First of all, we have some M113 APCs, along with some M48 A5s. That's the American name for them. Once the Israelis got a hold of them, they made a few adjustments, and this is what history more or less remembers as the Magach 3. There's also, like we said in the introduction elements of the 890th Paratrooper Brigade, again, they're not being deployed as paratroopers. They're not jumping out of aircraft or helicopters or anything. They're doing a tailgate jump out of those M113s. The Egyptians have all kinds of weapons coming in, all kinds of vehicles, mostly T-55s, because, of course, Egyptian Army, 1973. We're now, again, on the west bank of the Suez Canal, so we're into Egyptian Army deep reserves. We do see some IS-3s on the table, a lot of BTR-60 APCs, the wheeled APCs, and the ZSU-23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft artillery system as a defense and bulwark against the expected Israeli Air Force. The Israeli Air Force did play a pretty big role in the West Bank battles here near the tail end of the Yom Kippur War, although, again, Egyptian air defense was so thick and so heavy, they had a hell of a time, and you could almost see like a juxtaposition. Normally you send in your air power to soften things up for your ground troops. Once the Israelis were across the canal, the ground troops had to take out SAM sites and anti-aircraft sites and soften things up for the Air Force. Let's see if it turns out that way in today's game as well. Turn 1 has started, and this game is on. Now, these poker chips that you see either beneath the units or laid next to the units, we have green for the Egyptians and blue for the Israelis. This is just how we're tracking activations in the 7 days to the River Rhine game system. You can use chips, you can use dice, you can use counters, you can use whatever works well for your group. It doesn't really matter. But it is important that you carefully track the activations. It's a big part of how this system works. So you start off with a certain budget per turn, and that budget changes throughout the game. How many active units you have, your officers, the command doctrine of your faction, different things. You start off with a certain budget, and to activate one of your units, all you got to do is, well, lay an activation next to that unit, declare what you're doing, and then execute that activation. The secret is you can reactivate that same unit over and over again, or that unit can react during an enemy action and interrupt that action. The problem is the more times you use that same unit, number one, that costs extra actions and you only have so many, but even more immediate, there's a roll you have to make, and that roll gets increasingly difficult the more times you reactivate that same unit over and over again. It's a push your luck mechanic that can go badly wrong. Now that the Egyptians have been sighted, the Israelis are moving forward quickly with the hope of, getting some early shots and getting some first kills. The problem for the Israeli player here is that lead Magach used a rapid movement activation, which means he doesn't get to shoot. Therefore, it would be really bad for him to stay there. He's going to go ahead and fall back, just so he doesn't get clobbered by that T-55 there on the highway, and that Sagger team in the brush you can probably barely see on the very, very top of your screen. Out of my 5 players today, there are only 2 that have ever played 7 Days to the River Rhine before, and they've played it exactly once. So it's a learning game. It's a friendly table, everyone's learning, and with the weapons on this table, once it does get going, it's going to get going in a hurry. With some additional activations, we can see where some Israeli armor has moved forward again. See how that top Magach now has 2 poker checks on him to draw a bead on that BTR-60 APC. He did score a hit. His role was modified by some of the intervening terrain, that chain link fence, the low wall, a little bit of that hedge. Nevertheless, he scored a hit, and now we have to see if he penetrates the armor. Spoiler alert, we're talking about a 105mm rifle. Yeah, that was easy. Through the front of a BTR-60. Basically, he couldn't roll a 1, but he's now penetrated, so no worries there. But now we have to see whether or not that BTR-60 explodes or not, and here's why. Friendly infantry, namely that Sagger team right behind him there, hiding under that brush, is within 4 inches. And if a vehicle explodes, not just dies or gets eliminated, but if it explodes, and there's friendly infantry within 4 inches, that infantry team takes damage. Okay, it does explode. It's 4 up for a Warsaw Pact vehicle, 5 up for a NATO vehicle. So now that Sagger team has taken a morale token. We are now closing on the end of turn 1, and I'll be honest, it's starting to drag a little bit. But that's okay, because the reason the turn sequence is slowing down is players on both sides have very astutely clued in to the fact that, brother, you do not want to be the first guy that runs out of activations in the 7 days to the River Rhine game. Trust me. If at all humanly possible, always try to save at least 1, ideally several activations. That way, when the enemy's using up his last activations, you can at least react a little bit to what he's doing. If he's got activations and you don't, he's going to spend those remaining activations and run roughshod over, pretty much whatever part of the battlefield he wants. So how it passes over in this game, number 1, you can run out of activations. The enemy can be reacting against you and roll a natural 6. That means he basically steals the initiative from you. Or you can pass it over voluntarily, and that's what both sides are doing now. They are moving a unit, passing it over. The other side moves a single unit, passes it over. They're being very cagey and very careful. One of the Israeli players, Jennifer Berdu, is now going to reactivate one of her previously activated M48 Magach 3s. She wants a shot on that T-55 back there on the bridge. So this tank has activated once before. Therefore, she has to beat a 1 on a D6. She did that. And now there's going to be a second activation placed next to that tank to keep track of it. Because if she wants to activate that tank again, she has to beat a 2 now, and then a 3, and then a 4. And win or lose, it costs her one of her last order activations. So you see where this push your luck mechanic really starts to get acute, especially near the end of a given turn. But she made the roll, she put down the activation, and now the question on the table is, does that Egyptian tank want to react? The Egyptians do have activations left. They do see that tank up here. You do see, however, 2 previous activations under that T-55. So the math kind of works out. In order to activate against an enemy battle tank, you have to roll a 3+. But again, with those 2 poker checks there, now has to roll against a 5+. And it's going to cost, I think it's pretty much the Egyptians, either second to last or very last order activation. They have a quick conversation. They decide it's not worth it. The T-55 is going to eat that shot. They're going to hope the Israelis miss. Long story short, take your first shot. And that's a hit. All right, so the Israeli Magach gunner had a base to hit of 5+ on a D10. Add 1 to that difficulty because he's shooting through some cover. Add another 1 because he moved in the same activation. Long story short, take your second shot. He needed a 7 up on a D10, scored an 8, so that's a hit. Now we just have to figure out whether or not that round gets through the armor. All right, so the front armor on the T-55 is a 14. The weapon class on the M48 is a 9. Plus 9 equals 18. 18 beats the 14. That T-55 is now officially smoked. There is some nearby infantry. You can barely see him behind this building. We're going to roll to see if that tank actually explodes. And it turns out, yes, it does. Top of a new turn, and the first thing you do is you remove all previous activation counters. That's the blue and the green ones for Israelis and Egyptians respectively. Those white ones, though, those are going to remain because those are morale tokens. They indicate unit damage. Those Egyptian tanks swimming in the canal there, they're not really there. They're just kind of staged there because we are now beginning turn 2, and the Egyptians are starting to bring on some reinforcements. Speaking of Egyptians, one of Mark's opening moves here is to force march is one of his infantry teams. He's been really pushing them with multiple activations, reactivations, reactivations along the southern end of the table pretty much the whole game. That's how they got this far forward. And he now wants an RPG shot against one of Jennifer's tanks. She wants to pivot and react. That kind of tears up my table a little bit, but that's okay. But in order to make this activation roll, it's a pretty tough D6 check, because to spot infantry creeping up on your flank under cover, I know Israeli tank commanders famously fought unbuttoned, but the game gives you a pretty tough roll for spotting enemy infantry and reacting fast enough. This is where infantry become extremely dangerous versus tanks, especially when they get close. This is one of the first things I noticed in the 7 days to the River Rhine system, and when I first really started to fall in love with this system, is how the game, okay, there we see Jennifer failed her roll. So again, rest my case. Once enemy infantry gets this close to tanks, that's a bad thing. So the RPG is now going to take a shot. He's within 12 inches. RPGs are one of the few weapons in the game that actually has a range. So he's within his range. He's going to take a shot. The chance is a 5 up. It's going to become a 6 up because Jennifer's tank does have partial cover with that hedge there. So long story short, take your third shot. We are talking about a 5+, that's going to go up to a 6+ on a D10, and he only rolls a 5, so he fails. Mark, you hit the hedge. Mark, by the way, this is my revenge for my RPG2s constantly hitting the rice paddy berms in your Vietnam game, so take that. The Egyptians are now bringing on some reinforcements. I should note that the Egyptian reinforcements have to come in from the western end of the table. Israeli reinforcements come in from the easternmost 2 feet of the northern edge of the table. This, again, demonstrates the different directions from which the two armies were approaching each other in the larger context of the battlefield. With that big Egyptian tank column all clogged up on that road, Jennifer's thinking about bringing in one of her airstrikes. I should mention that in this scenario, I am not using the normal tactical advantage cards. Normally air power and artillery is very random in 7 days to the River Rhine. You draw cards. That's great for the theoretical, war that never was kind of a situation that 7 days was originally written for. This, however, is a historical scenario. This battle actually happened. So I take what was actually there as far as off-board assets and I pre-assign them into both sides' opening order of battle. These two units, man, these guys are having their own little war over here. So Mark's RPG has taken a second shot now at Jennifer's Magax. Missed again by 1 thanks to that hedge. Meanwhile, the Magax shot and they also missed. Some of these tanks over here on the bridge are taking some long-range shots against these Magax. Believe it or not, there is a line of sight. There's a lot of terrain obstruction, or I should say terrain hindrance, but there was a shot, but again, they missed. So a lot of Egyptian misses right now. They kind of realize they're not in the best position, so they pass over initiative to the Israelis. The Israelis, with an eye again on bringing in one of their A4 Skyhawk airstrikes, is going to try to suppress Egyptian air defense with perhaps a bazooka shot. Yes, that's a World War II bazooka against the Shilka, but again, that range is only 12 inches. They're not even close to being in range for that shot. Here comes the airstrike. The Egyptians do have a Shilka anti-aircraft vehicle in place that might be able to shoot down the A4 Skyhawk before he releases ordnance. The Egyptians better hope so. There's the Israeli aim point, and this thing does have a radius. Now, again, we are using some historical 1973 specific house rules for different airstrike package options. The Israelis can either bring in Snake and Nape for targets like infantry and artillery, or Rockeye cluster bombs against tanks. Either way, it's going to be hitting the flank armor on these T-55s. There really should be roof armor. We'll have to make them house rules for that one of these days. In any event, it's all up to the Shilka. Now he has to roll a 3+ on a D6 to react, a 6+ on a D10 to hit, and a 5+ on a D6 for the insta-kill, to shoot it down before it releases. It comes out to an aggregate 17% chance, and believe it or not, the Egyptians dodge a bullet, the A4 is shot out of the sky. The brawl in the brush continues, ladies and gentlemen. Mark has brought in a second Egyptian infantry team with more RPGs. I mean, hey, why have one RPG when you can have two, right? And that second team has gotten ridiculously close. I mean, even Mark might be able to score a hit at this range. He's been wailing away on those Magaks pretty much since the game started. He ain't got it done yet. At this point, you could pretty much throw the rocket like a yard dart. He needs a 5+, make it 6+ on a D10 because of the intervening hedge. Third time's the charm. He finally gets it done. Holy crap, miracles never cease. Now we just have to see whether or not he penetrates. He's got an armor piercing value of 8, which we are going to compare against the flank armor of the Magak, which has an 11. Cool. So if he rolls a 3 plus 8 becomes an 11, that's a tie. That immobilizes the Magak. Anything better kills it. He rolls a 7 plus 8 equals 15. That clearly defeats the flank armor of the Magak, and the Magak is now smoked. This is where Mark starts making fun of me about a similar situation in a previous game he was running last week, where my RPGs couldn't take out Marine Corps M48s, but he's taken out M48s just fine here. He says the opportunity was there, just not the ability. Alright, Mark, I see how it is. Here's what happens when the sideshow becomes the main event. So, Mark is bringing in still more infantry reinforcements. He's doing what the Egyptians like to do in 73 historically. There's more infantry hiding out in that brush there. He's trying to get that remaining Magak in a bit of a crossfire. To counter that, Jennifer Perdue is bringing in machine gun support from one of her M113s. That missed. These guys then took a shot, did some damage to those white morale tokens there. So this whole little area is turning into its own little war zone, which is the kind of fighting we really did see on the West Bank in 73. The terrain was so close. Again, all those agricultural projects, canals, farmhouses, buildings, generators, infrastructure, stuff like that, made for some short lines of fire and some very intense close quarters battle. Meanwhile, along the northern edge of the table, the tanks are going at it again. So this T-55 sort of pivoted behind that green brush, took hold down position behind that rise. That brush there kind of blocks his line of sight against the lower Magak, but he can barely scrape out a line of sight against that northern Magak that I'm pointing to there. Alright, so the Magak does get a reaction. We saw the blue poker check there. That reaction failed. Then the T-55 takes his initial action, scores a hit. There was a lot of penalties there because he's shooting over the wall and that chain link fence and all that other stuff. Did manage to get a pretty good roll and score a hit. Then Ron rolled a 9 on his penetration, which was enough to even get through the frontal armor of the Magak. So, yeah, a little bit of good die rolling there, and believe it or not only is that tank destroyed, it's also, you see the commander there in the cupola, that is an Israeli platoon leader. So that is going to affect the number of activations that the Israelis have available to them as we start the next turn. So hey, the Egyptians are definitely throwing some knuckles on this table. Alright everybody, there we are so far. Clearly the Egyptians are putting up one hell of a fight. Anybody who thinks that a history of the Arab-Israeli wars is pretty much the Israeli military beating up on all the armies around them clearly hasn't done very much reading or wargaming in the Yom Kippur War of 73. Now, part of what I find so interesting about the 73 war in general, and this table in particular, is how the two sides have very different portfolios of strengths. Clearly, the Israelis have a massive advantage with their armor and their air force. Granted, so far the Israeli Air Force hasn't made that big of a splash because the Egyptians got some very lucky air defense rolls. But I don't want to give away the end, but part 2 of this video comes out next week for the rest of this game. The Israeli Air Force does come back with a vengeance and makes a hell of a mess. They have 2 airstrikes left. Trust me, they get a little bit of payback. Conversely, the Egyptians have some huge advantages as well, the first of which is their infantry. Not only are there a lot more of them, both historically and on our table, but they have some killer anti-tank weapons. The AT-3 Sagar anti-tank missile, and on our table particularly, the RPG-7 anti-tank rocket. Again, spoilers for part 2. Next week, you're going to see the other huge Egyptian advantage in the 73 war, their artillery. Their off-board artillery is going to make a huge mess. Keep an eye out for that. So in summary, guys, this game isn't even close to over. Please stay tuned. Check out part 2 of this video coming out next week to see how it all shakes out. So we hope that you've enjoyed this content. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you did. You can also check out our Discord. There is an auto-accept invite link in the description. Check that out. Meanwhile, this is Risky Jim with the Sitrep Podcast. We are rounds complete for another episode, and as always, Tango Mike for watching.